Hello, One Book, One Norristown community. I am the Reverend Canon Betsy Ivey. I am the Canon for Growth and Support for the Episcopal Diocese of Pennsylvania, which is located at the Diocesan Center here in Norristown.
And I'm Father Chris Schwenk, the Vicar of St. John's here in Norristown.
I will be reading the first part of Chapter 7 of Lorene Cary's book, Price of a Child.
As a reminder of where we left off last week, here's a brief recap of Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, Happy Few, the Quicks discuss the need to relocate Mercer for safety's sake. They realize that if Mercer and her children are separated, they will be harder to trace. Cary convinces his Aunt Zilpha, who lives in Westchester, to let Mercer come and stay with her while the children remain in Philadelphia. Cary and Blanche continually argue, reinforcing the impression that theirs is not a happy marriage. He makes advances to Mercer, but they stop at a kiss. He tries to bury his attraction to Mercer by having sex with his wife. Blanche is revealed as very troubled and guilt-ridden over a prior abortion. Zilpha and Mercer set off for Westchester, where Mercer begins to experience a whole new way of life.
The chapter may use the N-word. Please be advised. Chapter 7, Make Your Mark. Mercer and Zilpha rose at dawn. The sky promised a fine day, dry at least, with only a gentle wind. Walking weather, Zilpha called it, and a good thing too, because Mercer had walking to do. Miss Eliza Ruffin's house was almost 5 miles away. Zilpha cautioned Mercer to leave at least an hour and a half to get there and not to be late, repeating one of her favorite sayings. You want to know the difference between a nigger and a Negro? A half hour. Zilpha stirred the embers in the stove. The fire crackled into life as they washed and dressed in the dark. After tea and bread, Zilpha left to do her day's nursing work, and Mercer began hanging the clothes she'd left to soak the night before. The linen was heavy and wet. Mercer squeezed it with numb fingers and shook it hard. It snapped in the morning's silence, disturbing the birds who, having finished their loud first light singing, had flocked to the slanting sun on the east-facing eaves of Gabriel's whitewashed cottage. Mercer snapped again and again. Each time a cold spray of water hit her face. At first she tucked her chin, but then it came to her that her face took water better than her head. So she blinked and let the water fly as she listened to the birds flutter with each crack of the fabric. Mercer felt the solidity of the brown earth under her feet and the contrast between her cold face and hands and her body, warm with exertion. The muscles of her back began to pull each time she raised her hands over her head. She did not think about her meeting. Before noon, Mercer ate a soup of onions and potatoes. Then she took in the laundry. She sprinkled it and put it on the finger covers that Zilpha had cut from old gloves over the years to protect the white linen from snags where her skin cracked around her nails or stains when it broke open and bled. Mercer ironed half the load by 1:30. Then she banked the fire, closed the shutters, and pulled on a gray wool cape. Then she banked the fire, closed the shutters, and pulled on a gray wool cape Harriet had given her. She was warm from the iron and the fire, and her palms were smooth and shiny from the starchy linen. She did not wash off the starch. Her hands were too sore and dry. Mercer walked fast. Harriet's letter, which she had successfully put out of her mind, came back to her. It reminded her, after a brief few weeks of serenity, of the fragility of her freedom. She felt herself becoming anxious. One fugitive wrote that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance. The Quicks had read her these things, but Mercer was beginning to know them for herself. She looked at the green and brown valley with vigilant eyes. Fields dotted with cabbage and kale, and bright winter suddenly lost their safety. She was no longer protected from her pursuers, but made conspicuous for them. She felt foolish to walk abroad upon the open road with her long stride and powerful thighs, as if she were a citizen. Neat stone farms, spring houses, ice houses, and smoke houses, corn cribs and barns, water wheels spinning in fast-running creeks, fat cows and black and white goats with teats full of milk, chickens and roosters and hens that laid tiny green and white eggs. These were other people's, white people's resources, as they had always been, not a commonwealth she could share. Behind the window curtains, slave catchers and kidnappers could be hiding, people who would aid and abet her capture, people who would watch and applaud or would look on indifferently or pitying her would only shake their heads as they might if a neighbor's dog were hit by a dray. They'd shake their heads and suck their tongues through thin lips like a gash in their faces and return gratefully to their money and milk-fed children, and even the most well-meaning of them would fall back on the rock-bottom fact of human intercourse. Better you than me. By the time Mercer arrived at Eliza Ruffin's house, she was rigid with distrust. A blonde woman with a blunt face opened the door. Behind her came Eliza Ruffin, dressed in a brown dress cut simply from rich fabric. She was tall but slight. She advanced with both hands extended and took Mercer's cold and shiny bare hands in her own soft ones. I am very grateful to you for agreeing to meet with me. We cast our wide net among our vigilant friends, but we could not know whether you would respond or even where you were, she said. Eliza Ruffin led Mercer into the alcove of a dark green parlor. They sat next to a small fire, and the household maid took Mercer's cloak before going to make tea. After the bright blue day, the parlor felt private and dark. Then Ruffin explained her interests. As president of the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society, in the welfare of fugitives, and especially female fugitives, and especially Mercer. But beyond that, Ruffin admitted, I have another particular interest in your case, and it is this. Passmore Williamson is my dear cousin. He's been in Moyamensing prison for close to a month now, and our lawyers cannot seem to get him out. Mercer studied Ruffin's face for resentment or blame. She had clear brown eyes and lush wavy hair. No doubt she was about to ask Mercer to do something to help Williamson. Mercer owed the man a great deal. But how much did she owe him? Was this woman with her clear-eyed welcome about to ask Mercer to go back? Maybe the anti-slavery people had had enough of doing good. Maybe Williamson had had enough of prison and figured it was time for a switch. Maybe it was Mercer's turn in the barrel. What we'd hope, said Miss Ruffin, was that the lawyers could have him purged of contempt. We hoped that by his asserting vigorously, and honestly, of course, that he was unable to produce you and your children in court, he would be freed. Well, but naturally, he cannot make such testimony unless he is allowed to appear in court, and he cannot appear so long as the judge holds him in contempt. The legal complications go on, but that's the outline, the sketch of it all. The lawyers have been to the Pennsylvania Superior Court, but they've ruled against us, so there's an end to it. Or not really an end, as they always say, because lawyers never give up, like people with things to sell, I suppose. She smiled a little. Mercer smiled back warily. What do you think I can do to help you, she asked. Well, your Captain Pryor has said that you and your children were abducted, kidnapped actually, and that Passmore and Mr. Still and the rest must stay to answer charges. And really the charges are ridiculous. Riot, mind you, forcible abduction, assault, and battery, that sort of thing. And for Passmore, it's worse, because he's white, and the law holds him more responsible than the others. Our lawyers, his lawyers, think that if you were to swear an affidavit, witnessed by some third or fourth disinterested party, we'd retain another lawyer for the purpose. That you left of your own free will, and Passmore did not abduct you. Why then, that might help his case. Flushed, she finished with an uncharacteristic flourish. What is an affidavit, Miss Ruffin? Eliza Ruffin seemed eager to explain that Mercer would not be required to do more than tell her version of the story to the lawyers, who would write it down and have her make her mark at the bottom. They would swear in court that it was she who had given the testimony and she who had signed it. It's a petition, really. That's all. But won't they want to see me in court? Impatience crept into Ruffin's voice. At this point, and I've said, no one is asking you to do any more than file a petition. I'm not ungrateful, Miss Ruffin. I am very, very grateful. I'm grateful for what everyone has done. I'm grateful to you now for talking to me and for giving me this choice. But what I'm learning, Miss Ruffin, is that being free costs dear. Now mind, it's not that I won't pay. I'm just trying to find out what all it's going to cost this time. It's quite likely that having received your affidavit, the judge will want to see you produced. Passmore is in prison for failing to answer the writ of habeas corpus. In other words, he has to stay in jail because he cannot produce your body. Produce my body. Yes. So you're quite astute to see that at some point, the people who have claimed to have seen you may also be asked to produce my body. Just so, Ruffin made with a quick little sigh. But at each step, it is your decision. Filing an affidavit does not obligate you to appear in court sometime later. You must know that. Mercer knew nothing of the sort. What she knew was that with this affidavit business, she'd be jumping onto a moving train. She might be on it already. I'll file that affidavit, Miss Ruffin. Ruffin sighed again. Her clear eyes had been hiding the extent of her anxiety. Excellent. They drank their tea, and somehow, while they chatted, Mercer found that she had agreed to return the next day at the same time to appear at Ruffin's anti-slavery meeting. Nothing was required of her, Ruffin said, except to appear and perhaps answer a few questions. The following day, Some anti-slavery friends, Ruffin described him, would come to transport Mercer to New York, where 2 lawyers would take her testimony. The men must be able to swear that they'd seen her in New York, Ruffin said, in order to keep Pryor and his agents from combing through Philadelphia's anti-slavery coalition and finding her and her children. Mercer agreed. Refusing Ruffin's offer of a servant and gig to take her home, she walked briskly in the gray and blue dusk. Pryor had done what he could. Now she would make her next move. The thought of action made her feel less at his mercy and less at the mercy of courts and judges and laws and marshals and officers who played by rigged sets of rules. He run his best. He won right into the hornet's nest. Could happen, she thought. The Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society meeting took place most weeks in a room off the Quaker Meeting House that the society shared with the temperance group. But because the temperance people had planned a special event for this afternoon, the Ladies' Society agreed to meet at Eliza Ruffin's house. Harriet's letter had explained the group to Mercer by way of convincing her to visit Ruffin. The Ladies' Society was not just an outgrowth of a men's group, but their own proper organization. They were Negro and white women together, and one of the colored women was a co-chairwoman, not as Harriet explained often happened in mixed groups, the helper. In principle, they occasionally met in one of the members' houses because they believed that women who worked together should not be ashamed to entertain each other in their houses. Although in practice, they met at Eliza Ruffin's, and no one protested or even took much notice that they did not alternate. As opposed to many groups that abhorred slavery but cared little for equality, the Ladies' Society believed that achieving the elevation of the free man by fighting discrimination in the North was inseparable, as the promoters of the year's Colored National Convention put it, from the great work of the slaves' restoration to freedom. They sponsored lectures and informal talks and fairs like everyone else, but mostly they liked their abolition radical. By the time Mercer arrived, a dozen women, 4 of them colored, were assembled in the upstairs parlor. They had arranged themselves in a half circle around the table where Eliza Ruffin sat pouring tea. The late afternoon was sunny and cold, but Eliza Ruffin's fire was just the slightest bit warmer than the one she had lit the day before in the downstairs parlor. 2 ruddy-faced women shared a large chair and talked loudly about the virtues of not eating red meat. They moved on to the subject of vigorous exercise, then in genteel language and with giggles, to moderation in conjugal relations. Mr. Graham has worked out quite a specific regimen, and he says without question that it will relieve debility. The Mr. Graham who makes the crackers, the same, yes. Relieve or prevent? Excuse me. Prevention, of course, as in all matters of health, our first concern. But the system relieves as well. Priscilla is a wonderful advertisement. You are the picture of health. She always was. Well, yes, I've been blessed. But this regimen, my eye, Beth put her finger on it. Priscilla has never been sick a day in her life. I know you see, Priscilla. I was there when your mother, my Aunt Ruth, fed your family a lovely rare chop every morning, noon and night. I never saw so much meat, red, quite red, and kept you in the house by hour. You were the picture of health then, and you're the picture of health now. Well, I like Well, I say, like Sojourner Truth said, is God dead? What I mean is, do Mr. Graham and these other people who presume to keep one alive forever, do they talk about the restorative powers of prayer? I've seen it, you know. She slapped her thigh several times. Merriman sneaked shamefully out of the room. The women, all but a couple, hung their heads or else looked reverently at the speaker's ample thigh and the pudgy hand that patted it. They said I'd never walk. Some of you here prayed for me. Don't you remember? I don't have to give up me to do it. The tender hand of God touched me right here. Again, she whacked the recovered thigh harder. Mercer began to think it was a little too much punishment for a limb that had been ailing. Eliza Ruffin moved to stand next to Mercer's chair, and the stout woman's hand settled in her lap. Then she introduced Mercer to the group, saying that she could not tell them Mercer's former name, or the circumstances of her liberation, or even how long she had been out of the South. Some of them had guessed who Mercer was, and they would tell the others later. It pleased them, however, to strike a note of secrecy in their meetings and to remind themselves of the gravity of their actions. I can say, however, that this woman's courage has made an indelible impression on me, and I think I can also say that she'd be willing to inform us from her own experience about the institution we've all sworn to erase from this country. They clapped surprisingly quietly and began to fuss over Mercer's chair and her tea and what to put into it and whether or not she wanted a cake. To Mercer, these women were a curious lot, at once girlish and old ladylike. A small copper-colored woman spoke to Mercer through teeth and lips she barely moved as she talked, as if not to disturb them. I think you'll find a dear, good friend in Eliza. Then, for no apparent reason, she continued. I was just telling someone the other day that the greatest wish of my life is quite simple. Only to live quietly and modestly with a few dear friends and to do good in the world and make others better and happier. Mercer smiled at her. So what, she thought. I like rhubarb pie. Who the hell asked you? Her sudden irritation surprised her. Do you do this often? Beg pardon? Do you often come to talk to groups like ours? Oh no, Eliza Ruffin cut her off with an apologetic look. Mercer's just begun this sort of work, and she looked toward her deferentially. If I'm not correct, Mercer, you're deciding whether or not the work suits you. Mercer nodded, realizing that she was supposed to go along with this cloaking of her identity. But if these women were truly friends of the slave, why should she have to be so secretive? She turned back to her tea. It was milky and sweet. Mercer sipped out of a cup so thin she suspected she might bite it through if she didn't take care. Well, I think it is most important to make others better, and if they're happier in the process, so much the good, said the copper-colored lady. Mercer could tell that her sips were too noisy. She could tell from how they looked at her. Of course, one is happier if one is better. Well, it came from the redhead who earlier refused to moderate her red meat consumption, and it had laughed loudest about limiting marital relations. I must admit that I am very, very happy in the summer at the seaside, when I'm not engaged in any work at all, and I'm not being of any service to anyone. Is that wicked? Is it? Isn't it? Of course, said the colored woman from behind those taut lips. Happy is too simple a word. Being at the seaside makes us happy. A child eating a candy is happy, but making others' lives better, such as work with the downtrodden, brings a joy that is longer lasting and more profound.
The women shook their heads and moaned softly together. Well, Mercer guessed that set her straight. Happy sneaked out of the room and joined Merriment down the hall. At risk of shattering her cup, Mercer finished her tea. Eliza Ruffin promptly refilled the cup. How then did she go from sitting in their midst, drinking tea, to standing before them, turned, with her skirts raised to let them see the scars on her thighs? She would look back just days later and be unable to recall. She did remember how they strained with attention, how they asked her one question after another. Who had done this to her? For what transgression? How long was she beaten? With what object? How old was she when it happened? What had she done about it? What did other slaves do to help her? Did it bleed? How had she healed? How much of her body did the scars cover? Were all her people treated likewise? Was that why she'd run away, to avoid more beatings? The room darkened as evening approached. They closed the shutters and lit the lamps. The lamplight bounced off their faces and onto her legs, still bared, suffusing the room with the glow of their curiosity. Had a man done this to her? Had he done it to take her virtue? Had he forced her? They filled their eyes with her. They rubbed their clean, white fingers against each other impatiently, as men rub themselves absently when a woman walked by. The skin of Mercer's forearm was mottled and shiny where she'd once been scalded. Maybe they'd like to have a look at that too. Or maybe the toe where the nail had dropped off that winter before she'd started working in the kitchen with Susie, when people lost whole toes from being out tending to the animals, but she'd lost only a nail and a tip. They wouldn't want to hear about that, though, she figured. They wanted to knock down, drag out. That much she could tell. They wanted the horsewhip and pony whip, the green sapling branch, the leather belt and bridle cord. They wanted the old man with nubs for fingers standing in the circle of blows. Did you bleed? They wanted a crazy-ass overseer and her on the ground, twitching and calling for Jesus. Why? Why did they want it so? Did you bleed? They wanted her crying and snotting into the clay, dirty, filthy, violated. Why did you bleed? They wanted Jackson Pryor crooking his finger at her after dinner, or better yet, beating her first. They wanted rape in the room with them, on her body, contained in her body, the better to keep them safe. Did it hurt? Hurt bad? Did you bleed? Mercer dropped her skirts. She had been looked at plenty. Eliza Ruffin said, I think we've asked enough of Mercer today. They fetched her more tea and a little white cake with vanilla butter icing. She ate it slowly and sat wanting more while they concluded their other business. That night, Zilpha finished reading aloud the first book of Samuel. Mercer dreamt that God was calling Benny, but Benny did not know who was calling him. When are they taking you to New York? Zilpha asked. The two women lay propped on pillows in their beds as Zilpha had prescribed. The sky outside their small square window had begun to lighten. Zilpha reached for the glass of water she left for herself on the nightstand each evening. She gargled 2 mouthfuls loudly and swallowed hard. Today. Well, Zilpha said, I'll be sorry to see you go. You've been good to have around, Mercer, and that's the God's truth. I thank you for having me. Mercer wondered where she'd be going after New York. They might offer to bring me back here. It's only a day or two that they need me. You're welcome back any time. I don't have no trouble out of you. You're clean and you know how to do things right. And you know how to talk and how not to talk. Mercer laughed. Yes, ma'am. quiet and clean. Zilpha and Pryor liked her for similar reasons. She forced herself out of the warm bed and into the cold room and cold clothes, and then outside into the colder, thin stink of the privy, where she emptied Zilpha's chamber pot. She laughed at herself again. Zilpha would no doubt miss her. When she came back indoors, she washed, and the two women ate oat porridge that had steeped overnight in the well of the cook stove. Zilpha had no job that day, so she sat in her chair and directed in minute detail Mercer's travel preparations. Take some food now. Take enough for two, and don't forget to offer it. Mercer packed biscuits, a square of cheese, 4 strips of cold bacon, 2 boiled potatoes, and some pickled cucumbers and apples in a basket. At 6, a sallow-faced man in burgundy and black livery called for her. He led her to a carriage and helped her in. In the corner sat an older white woman. She wore a gathered white cap on her silver hair and a brown cape over a heavy brown frock. "Come in," she said, looking accustomed to command. "My name is Mrs. Eugenia Pitts, and I will escort you to New York." She did not ask Mercer about herself, or about what Mercer might know. Instead, she told her in a pleasing voice about Congress and the Senate, the fugitive slave law, and the case of Anthony Burns in Boston, the bloody confrontation in Christiana, Pennsylvania, not far from where Mercer had been staying, in which a master hell-bent on reclaiming his slaves was shot and killed by them as he attempted to enter their house. Mrs. Pitts told Mercer about her own private meetings with Frederick Douglass, and nodded her approval on hearing that Zilpha and Mercer were reading his book already. She told her about Mary Shad Cary, who edited a newspaper in Canada, and without asking whether Mercer could read or write, she urged her for her own and her children's sake to learn to do so. Given her pleasing appearance and natural speaking ability, reported to Miss Pitts by the anti-slavery ladies, Mercer ought to consider speaking to groups of abolitionists and potential friends to the cause, just as she had done yesterday. "You made a deep impression on those women," she said. "A few of them had never seen a former slave or talked to one, and I'm afraid that the propagandists from the South have so thoroughly dominated the arguments that many perfectly reasonable people in the North think all Negroes quite degraded, incapable of ever governing themselves, and as senseless of their bondage as horses." Later, when Mercer would hold in her hands the precious copy of Douglass's narrative given her by Mrs. Pitts, you, of all people, should have your own copy to keep, not a borrowed one. She'd reread a couple early sentences and remember that precise moment in the carriage. "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant." She'd remember how they warmed their feet on hot bricks on the floor. She'd remember Mrs. Pitt's musical voice, her vehement ideas, and her call to action. And Mercer, who as Virginia had dreamt of freedom and acted upon it, Mercer, the daughter of Virgil, the runaway man, and Lily, the beautiful and broken woman. This same Mercer would read Douglass's words, and behold, a man made into a brute, and recall how often she had thought of herself as a mule, an old mule pulling uphill, wanting nothing more than a mat to lie on and slop to eat. But for now, the mention of horses merely made Mercer vaguely uncomfortable amid her carriage-riding comfort. The words struck in her craw and in her memory, and the sound of their own horses' hoofs droned rhythmically in her ears as if to mock her. Mrs. Pitts ended her lecture abruptly. "Well, that's enough, I think. That's as much as one body can take in for a morning. But I do want to be of help to you, Mercer. I'd like to think of something else I can do for you, or maybe your children." She looked at Mercer and then away. "Can you think of anything offhand? Well, we'll come up with something." After a while, she settled into gossip about the men and women in the abolitionist circles in New York. Mercer could hardly follow because she did not know any of the people. Naomi Rutledge, whom you'll be sure to meet, was once the director of the New York Society for the Encouragement of Faithful Domestics. Can you believe that? Well, her own domestics, it seemed, were leaving at a frightful rate, and everyone except poor Naomi knew it was her husband. Changed her mind about the servant class, and that led her to abolition. Funny the paths people take to this work. She smiled indulgently, rested her head on the cushion, and closed her eyes. "Would you care to share my lunch?" Mercer asked. Mrs. Pitts opened her eyes and took her time observing Mercer. "You are quite natural, you know. It's delightful." Then she closed her eyes again. "You should rest now," she advised Mercer. "You'll want all your strength in New York." They crossed into New York on a ferry. Mercer could smell the city halfway across the river. She remembered that Cary did not like New York. As a young man, he'd heard accounts of the anti-abolition riots there in the 30s. One colored woman reported seeing a mob of 5 white men going into an apartment where a colored woman had recently given birth. They raped the woman and threw her 3-day-old baby out the window. "I see New York," Ivey said, "and all I want to do is keep going north." At the dock, hack drivers shouted at them. Eugenia Pitts seemed undisturbed by the commotion. She raised her hand and waved at a man half a block away. Jumping down from his seat, he ran to them. He had long arms and a limp. He loaded their bags in his hand and under his arms until his torso was hidden, and then he bustled them back to the trap. "This is my brother's driver," Mrs. Pitts said, by way of introduction. To him, she said sternly, "There's not enough room." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pitts. You know better than that. I left word to bring the carriage." "I'll sit in the back," Mercer said. The driver nodded gratefully. "Yes, yes." "You can't do that." Mercer shrugged. It was silly to argue. Mrs. Pitts wasn't sitting in the back. "Well then, let's get out of the filthy street." They picked their way through excrement, from stray dogs and cats and from horses, and in alleys from outdoor people. Pigeons picked the droppings for corn. Rats scurried from the sewers in broad daylight to raid the grain carcass of a dead horse and piles of garbage waiting for collection. And from every dark corner, under every stone archway, wafted the smell of urine. Then, on the main streets away from the wharves, Mercer began to see the size of the city and the number of people. Bunches of New Yorkers waited on corners. They rode in every kind of public and private conveyance and pulled all sorts of carts. They ran and walked and dodged the cars. They went into and out of hundreds of shops. They ate on the street and spat onto the ground and yelled and bought and sold. Dirty, poorly clad white children hawked their wares on the streets too, faces red and pocked, noses running snot. Look what they do to their own, Mercer thought. No wonder colored orphanages got burned down. New York made Philadelphia seem modest by comparison. The buildings were taller, the streets twice as wide. Here, Mercer felt safe from detection, yet vulnerable to dangers she couldn't even imagine. They stopped briefly at the home of Eugenia Pitts' brother. The street had been swept and the steps washed. Only a few carriages clattered past. The house was a large gray stone townhouse, empty of the family but full of servants. They took Mrs. Pitts to one room and Mercer to another. Mercer washed self-consciously in a blue and white china bowl with soap the color and shape of an eggshell. Then she dried herself, changed her blouse, and put her hat back on. The water and towel were so dirty that she looked for a place to empty them and ended up sloshing her skirt. "I'll take that," the maid said from behind her. Mercer was glad that Eugenia Pitts had already gone downstairs to wait for her. "Hurry," she called. "They're expecting us." In the lawyer's New York office, in the muffled quiet of green bays and dark wood, Mr. Henry, the lawyer, gave instructions to the clerk who would take her statement. Then he spoke to Mercer. "I will take this statement into a court of law," he said. His voice was full of importance. Clearly, he doubted whether Mercer understood the gravity of the situation. "You must assure me that every word is true and that the overall meaning given is completely true, nothing included that need not be, and nothing wanting." Mercer said, "I understand, sir. I understand when Mr. Williamson and Mr. Still were good enough to come to my aid in Philadelphia." Mr. Henry turned abruptly to leave the room. "Begin," he said to the clerk, whose name Mercer never caught. "State of New York, City and County of New York," the clerk read as he wrote. "Virginia Pryor, being sworn, makes oath and says." He examined her with pale blue eyes, behind thick spectacles. Mercer would have to use her old name. It no longer fit. "Now you," he said. "My name is Virginia Pryor, and I was the slave of Captain Pryor of Virginia. He received me from his father, who owned my parents. I have 2 children, the youngest between 6 and 7 years old, the oldest between 12 and 13, and 1 more child in Virginia, between 2 and 3, who I never expect to see again in this life." Mercer paused to collect her thoughts and tell the story. "If I may," said the clerk, "not who you are, but what happened on the afternoon of October 1st, 1855. Mercer ignored him. She was talking, and Mr. Clerk without a name would have to wait. He puffed his cheeks and blew out. "I'm losing my thought," Mercer said blandly. "I'll have to think some more." She began with Pryor's bringing her to Philadelphia and the hotel, the chambermaid who would not help them, and Nignag who did, and the boat and the rescue. At the end, the clerk nodded his head as if to signal that she'd finished, but she hadn't. "Please," she said, pausing again to think how to make an end to her story. The clerk made a show of looking restless. Too bad, Mercer thought. He'd have to wait before it was time to run to Mr. Henry with the big voice and get himself another job to do. He'd have to spend more of his precious time writing down the words of a Negro woman. Too bad. "I don't want to go back," she said. "Of course not," the clerk said. "No, sir. Please write that down, too." "What?" "I don't want to go back." "Oh." He pressed his lips together hard and wrote. "I could have gone in Philadelphia if I wanted to. I could go now, but I'd rather die than go back. I wish to make this statement before the magistrate, because I understand that Mr. Williamson is in prison on my account, and I hope the truth may benefit him. There now. Thank you. Put your mark above your name here. I can write my name. It's already written. Kindly make your mark."